Taoiseach's very welcome apology today on behalf of the state is long overdue. The Magdalene women have waited for this moment. They've hoped for it. They prayed for it. I think many of them despaired that it might never come, but it has. And today we have a full acknowledgement of the wrong done to them. They were wronged. The state was complicit in their detention and abuse in the laundries. The state oversaw a system of slave labour, had commercial relationships with and inspected the laundries. The state was party to the wholesale violation of the basic freedoms and rights of girls and women detained in these laundries. Their arbitrary detention, their servitude and forced labour was illegal. The state broke the law. The state broke the law repeatedly and over a period of decades. And the state is liable for these unlawful acts and for failing in its legal duties to uphold and vindicate the rights of the girls and women. And that really is what today's apology is all about. The acknowledgement of hurt and of suffering, of course, that is absolutely essential for the women. But the state accepting its responsibility, its liability, and its failures, that really is the crucial part. The apology is just the first step in securing justice for the women. And redress and compensation must now follow to make some amends. In other words, the apology must be matched with actions. The story of the Magdalene Laundries brings us face to face once again with all too familiar themes of shame, of stigma, of silence and secrecy. Themes that have defined the systemic abuse of women and children in Irish society for generations.
I ask the people in the public gallery to remain silent because it's a little bit unfair on the speaker in position. I understand the night is in it, but...
Well, Cahirlach, if I may be unorthodox and overrule you and say to people in the public gallery, work away. Themes that have defined the systemic abuse of women and children in Irish society for generations. And this is not the stuff of history. And I think we would be fooling ourselves, but nobody else, in the course of this debate, if we thought for a second that this approach to women and children, vulnerable women and vulnerable children, is a thing of the past. It is not. It lives with us yet in society today. Deliberate cruelty was visited on young, vulnerable women for decades, with the active connivance of the state, and all the while Irish society looked the other way. Now, it might be convenient for us at this distance to somehow say or claim that we didn't know, but I think it would be more honest to say that we didn't want to know. And the truth so came out slowly, but came forcefully. The work of courageous journalism, I think most notably the late Mary Raftery, the inquiries into industrial schools, the diligence of human rights activists, advocacy groups, but above all, the immense bravery of Magdalene women and their families put the truth on the record. We've known of the trauma endured by women and girls for some time. The Ryan report of 2009 made an explicit reference to the abuse suffered in the Magdalene Laundries. Archival material and the women's testimony painstakingly gathered by Justice for Magdalenes had long established a history of abuse and state involvement in that abuse. And still and yet, it took the UN Committee on Torture to force the hand of the state to address this issue. Because in 2011, just 20 months ago, the instinct of this state was still to look the other way and to deny its part in the Magdalene Laundries. The McAleese review and report was set the task of establishing the extent of state involvement in the laundries. The report published 2 weeks ago confirms again state complicity in the detention of women and in breaches of their constitutional and human rights. And I believe that the report is to be commended for reiterating these facts. However, it needs to be said that the report is not a full nor a final account of the laundries and the women's experiences in them. The information and records examined by the committee was incomplete, and the report acknowledges that statistics on routes of admission and lengths of stay are substantially incomplete. The route of entry for almost half of the women and girls is not recorded. In the case of length of stay, there is no data for 58% of admissions. The lack of information in relation to the laundry in Dúnléire and the very partial records for Galway are noted in the report. And of course, the exclusion of Stanhope Street and Summerhill laundries from consideration by the committee and from the report represent another large gap in the story. The committee heard from just 118 surviving women from the laundries, and it was a disappointment that the written submissions of survivors were not fully reflected in the report. The finding that there was no physical abuse, I think, is the one that gave rise to most commentary, because it simply doesn't tally with available evidence. Not alone does survivor testimony flatly contradict this finding, but the report itself instances occasion of solitary confinement and deprivation, which are, by any definition, physical abuse. And yet, the McAleese report confirms state collusion with the Magdalene Laundries. This is its central achievement, and it is to be commended for that. I note with interest the Government and Minister's announcement this evening of the appointment of Justice John Quirke to report back within a period of 3 months. I have to say that 3 months is a rather lengthy period for deliberation, and I would ask that the government reconsider that. I welcome also their commitment to a redress process that will be non-adversarial. I think that's how it has to be. But I want to sound a note of caution, because it cannot be left to one individual, no matter how honourable, no matter how eminent, to adjudicate on these matters. It is absolutely essential that the redress process accords with rules of natural justice, of fair procedure, and that it is fully transparent. And for that reason, I believe that any redress scheme must be put on a statutory footing, must have adequate oversight, must have a right of appeal. And I am a little bit concerned this evening because the indications are that all of that rigour and clarity and transparency perhaps won't apply to what the government have in mind. I would ask them to revisit that, and I would also say to them, whilst nobody wants the redress procedure to be a kind of bonanza for the legal profession, that's certainly not what the survivors want. But I would equally be concerned that the government is ruling out the spending of any money on legal advice that the women and survivors might require. I think that that is ill-judged, and I think it could prove detrimental to the process and indeed very unfair to the women. But we'll come back to those issues on another day. For all of the women, really, there is no way in which we can fully compensate them. That can't be done. We can't give them back the years spent in slavery in these institutions. We can't give them back their youth, their innocence, their optimism. And I am also conscious that for many of the women, there can be no redress because they are no longer around. And for me, I suppose the most traumatic part of what is a deeply traumatic story is the manner in which some of the women died and were buried. They had lived without the dignity of their name, and they died without the the dignity of their name. The Magdalene women have done this state a great service. Their testimony, their stories, have sharply confronted the historic ambivalence of the state regarding physical abuse of women and children. And that ambivalence is still with us. And I believe that the Magdalene women put it up to all of us now to confront and rectify abuses in the system, both historic and current. And I instance the Bethany home. It is disgraceful that yet again those victims and survivors are excluded from yet another redress mechanism. That is not good enough, and that cannot continue. I instance the enforced illegal adoption of Irish babies here in this country and abroad, a scandal simmering just beneath the surface that we must deal with. I instance the victims of symphysiotomy, all 1,500 women who were butchered in state and state-funded voluntary hospitals and who have yet to have had any acknowledgement. The Magdalene women have made it very, very clear that when women are wronged, that women will demand justice. And they have led the way, and we owe them a very, very great debt. And today, the full vindication of the Magdalene women is beginning. Their truth, their stories, their lives, above all, their courage and dignity have brought us to this moment of apology. Girls and women held against their will, enslaved, belittled, and damaged. And yet today, they triumph. Today, the responsibility of the state, its neglect, its collusion, its complicity in the abuses of the Laundries is acknowledged fully and finally.